It was past midnight, yet the lamps in the corridor burned with a harsh, artificial light that made shadows crawl along the walls like restless spirits. Alexei sat on the cold wooden bench of his cell, his back pressed against the splintered wall, hands bound with coarse rope that bit into his wrists. The air was thick with the stench of damp clothing, iron, and despair. Outside, the wind rattled the barred windows, carrying with it the faint, almost musical sound of distant chains. And then, she appeared. At first, he thought it was a trick of the dim light, a hallucination born from hunger and exhaustion. She stood in the doorway, her presence commanding, yet impossibly delicate, like a shadow carved from ice. The uniform she wore was stiff and black, contrasting with the pale, almost luminescent skin of her face. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, fixed on him in a way that made his stomach twist. "Say your name," she said, her voice low, a whisper that still carried authority. Alexei's throat tightened. His voice came out barely audible, trembling as if the words themselves were dangerous. "Alexei," he stammered. She tilted her head slightly, as if weighing his very existence, and then, without a word, turned and left. The door slammed behind her with a sound that echoed through the empty hall, leaving him alone with his pounding heart and the gnawing fear that something had shifted inside him. Something dangerous. Something he could not name. Days passed, each one blending into the next, a cycle of cold, hunger, and fear. The interrogations came like clockwork, each question designed to break him. Yet she always came. Sometimes early in the morning, before the others had woken, her footsteps soft and precise, and he would feel the gaze of her eyes burning through the dimness. One night, he could not hold back the question any longer. Why do you do this to me?" His voice barely rose above a whisper. She crouched before him, the cold floor pressing against her knees, and her gaze searched his face as if she were trying to read the lines of his soul. "Because I must," she said quietly. "Because it is my duty." For some reason, that answer, so simple, so matter-of-fact, made him feel a strange comfort. The acknowledgement of her duty, of her role in the machine that had imprisoned him, gave shape to his fear. And in that shape, he found fascination. Weeks passed. Alexei began to notice the small, almost imperceptible gestures she made. The way she lingered just a moment longer at the doorway, the faintest softening in her eyes when he looked up at her, the subtle hesitation of her hand before it delivered pain. It was a dangerous attention to detail, one that could get him killed, yet he could not help it. One morning, a guard came to the cell. "Today, you will see the commander," he said with a smirk, his eyes glinting with malice. Alexei felt the cold spread through his veins. The commander's office was a place where decisions were final, where life and death were weighed on the edge of a pen. He was to be judged, and perhaps executed. She stood at the door, as always, but this time her eyes flicked toward him with something he had never seen, a subtle acknowledgement, almost a plea. "Help me," he whispered under his breath, not knowing if she could hear, not knowing if the words would condemn him further. She nodded ever so slightly. That nod, fragile and fleeting, became his anchor in a world gone mad. For a brief, forbidden instant, Alexei believed in her, not as an enemy, not as a jailer, but as someone who might see him as a human being, as someone alive and not just a body to be broken. The journey to the commander's office was silent, the hallways echoing with the sound of his own shuffling feet. Each step was a gamble, each breath a reminder of how close death hovered. Behind him, her footsteps followed, quiet, measured. "Do not fear me," she whispered, barely audible, and he realized she was offering him a lifeline, and yet the lifeline was tangled in danger. In the office, the commander sat behind a large, austere desk. His eyes were cold, his expression unreadable. He looked between them and asked, "Do you love him?" He directed the question at her, his voice calm, but carrying a lethal weight. Her lips parted, and for a moment she seemed to falter. I was supposed to hate him," she said softly, her voice almost breaking. "But—" She trailed off, and in that pause, Alexei felt a surge of hope and simultaneously a terror. He could not breathe. The commander leaned forward, the air thick with the unspoken threat of the power he wielded. "Do you love him?" he repeated, sharper this time. Her eyes met his, steady, defiant, and terrifying. She nodded slightly. In that instant, Alexei understood something profound, that love could exist even here, in the cold machinery of cruelty, yet it did not grant safety. It was a perilous thing, a fire that could burn or illuminate, depending on its keeper. As they left the office, Alexei thought the ordeal had ended. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a trace of a smile, a dangerous, fragile curve of her lips. But then a shout broke the fragile illusion. "The commander has ordered execution!" The blood drained from Alexei's face. She gripped his hand, hard, and whispered urgently, "Run!" Her sacrifice was immediate, decisive, incomprehensible. The hall erupted into chaos as guards shouted and rushed. He ran, heart hammering, limbs driven by pure instinct. He did not look back, could not, even as the sound of gunfire split the night and the echoes of her courage chased him into the snow. He emerged into the freezing night, gasping, body shaking, lungs burning with the icy wind. Alive, yes, but haunted. Every heartbeat reminded him of the impossible, terrible love he had felt, and the cruel reality that she had remained behind. She had chosen to protect him, even knowing the cost. And as the snow fell around him, soft and relentless, Alexei realized something horrifying. Love, even the most forbidden and beautiful, could not defeat the darkness of the world. It could only illuminate it for a moment, before leaving you alone in the cold. He stumbled forward into the darkness, carrying her memory like a scar, an eternal, unhealable wound. And deep within him, a single, unshakable thought took root. He would never forget her, and he would never forgive the world that had made such a thing possible. Snow bit through the thin layers of his coat as Alexei stumbled through the forest that skirted the edges of the camp. Each breath came in sharp, painful bursts, freezing in his lungs and throat. Behind him, the distant echo of shouts and the rattle of boots reminded him that the world he had fled was still alive, still hunting him. Yet something stronger than fear drove him forward, the memory of her hand in his, the fragile warmth of her whisper. "Run." He paused for a moment, leaning against a frozen birch, and tried to catch his breath. His mind was a tempest of images. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, haunted him. He could not stop thinking about the way she had looked at him in the commander's office, the way her lips had curved in that fleeting smile. It was maddening to remember it, knowing he might never see her again, knowing she had stayed behind, risking everything for him. He forced himself to keep moving. The snow grew deeper as night descended fully, the trees forming dark silhouettes that seemed to lean toward him, whispering in the wind. Hunger gnawed at his belly, but he did not dare stop for food. He had learned in the camp that hesitation was death. Survival required a single-mindedness that left no room for sentiment, yet he could not suppress the relentless thoughts of her. Hours passed, or perhaps it was minutes. He had lost all sense of time. Exhaustion made his steps uncertain, his muscles screamed for rest, yet he pressed on. Then, just as he reached the edge of a frozen river, he collapsed. His body could take no more. Lying there, shivering, he closed his eyes and let his mind drift to the only solace he could find, the memory of her voice. "Do not fear me," she had whispered. "I see life in you." He shivered, not entirely from cold. The memory was electric, burning in his chest. Why had she cared? Why had a woman who held his life in her hands chosen to protect him, to offer a fleeting chance at escape? The thought was unbearable, and yet it fueled him. When dawn finally broke, pale and cold, he woke to find himself surrounded by an endless expanse of snow. The camp was behind him, invisible, yet the fear lingered like a shadow. He forced himself to rise, leaning on the frozen earth, and began moving again. He needed to reach a village, any sign of life that could provide shelter. As he trudged through the snow, memories of the camp returned with relentless clarity. The screams, the interrogations, the silent punishments, each image a wound that refused to heal. Yet among the horrors, her presence shone, a bizarre paradox. She had been the instrument of fear and simultaneously its relief. How could one person embody both terror and salvation? He did not understand, and perhaps he never would. Hours later, exhausted and near collapse, he stumbled into a clearing and saw the faint outline of a small village. Smoke rose from chimneys, and he felt a flicker of hope. Yet even here, danger was not gone. He knew that escapees were hunted relentlessly, and that trust was a luxury he could not afford. He found a barn at the edge of the village and slipped inside, collapsing against the cold wooden walls. Hunger and fatigue threatened to overwhelm him. He closed his eyes, and in the dark of that barn, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. Her sacrifice had saved him, and he would never forget it. He would carry her memory through the nights, through the fear, through the endless struggle to survive. The next few days were a blur of cold, hunger, and constant vigilance. He moved under cover of darkness, avoiding patrols, scavenging for food where he could. Each step was a test of endurance, and each night he dreamed of her. In those dreams, she was both jailer and savior, her gaze a combination of warning and invitation. He did not understand his feelings, and the paradox terrified him. How could one survive a world that demanded hatred and yet feel a forbidden warmth toward the very person who had inflicted suffering? One evening, as he hid in the ruins of an abandoned house, he thought he saw a figure in the distance, silhouetted against the dying light. For a moment, his heart leaped. Could it be her? Could she have somehow escaped, or perhaps followed him to ensure his survival? He strained his eyes, but the figure vanished into the shadows. He could not know whether hope or madness had conjured it. That night, he sat against the wall of the ruined house, shivering, and spoke aloud to the darkness. "Why did you care for me?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why me? Out of all the lives, why mine?" There was no answer, only the whisper of the wind through broken windows. He understood, painfully, that he might never know. And yet, the thought of her lingered, shaping his resolve. He would survive. He would honor the impossible act she had made. He would live, even if the world had made survival a torment. In the following days, Alexei learned to move with a predator's awareness. He watched. He listened. He became attuned to every sound, every movement. Hunger gnawed at him, yet he found sustenance in wild roots, in stolen scraps from villages too fearful to confront him. The landscape became both ally and enemy, each tree a shield, each shadow a potential threat. During one particularly harsh night, he huddled in a cave to escape a sudden storm. The cold was relentless, but it was nothing compared to the chill that had settled in his chest, the absence of her presence. He whispered her name into the darkness, and the cave seemed to swallow it, leaving only the echo of his own despair. Days turned into weeks. Alexei grew thinner, yet his resolve hardened. He began to imagine a plan, a distant hope of return, not just for revenge or survival, but for the impossible, fragile connection that bound him to her. He did not know if she was alive, did not know if she had survived the commander's wrath. And yet, he could not abandon the idea that somewhere, beyond the shadows of the camp, she was waiting.
It was during this time that he encountered another survivor, a man who had escaped from the same camp months earlier. His name was Mikhail, a wiry man with eyes that had seen too much. He regarded Alexei with suspicion at first, but over time shared food and knowledge of the surrounding terrain. Mikhail warned him of patrols, of tracking dogs, of the dangers that still lurked. Yet, in conversation, Alexei found himself speaking of her, of the woman who had both tortured and saved him. Mikhail laughed bitterly. "Love? In the camp? You're mad." Alexei shook his head. "It is not love in the way you understand it," he said quietly. "It is something else. Something that survived the horror. Something that made me human." Mikhail did not respond, but his silence spoke volumes. He had survived, yes, but survival had cost him his humanity, his hope, his heart. Alexei felt the weight of that truth. To live in this world required sacrifice, and yet, in his chest, the spark she had left burned with stubborn persistence. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the snow in shades of blood and gold, Alexei and Mikhail came across an abandoned cabin. It offered shelter, warmth, and a momentary reprieve. As Alexei huddled by the fire, he allowed himself a dangerous indulgence. He imagined her face, her eyes, her lips, and the sound of her whisper. He knew that to dwell on it too long could be madness, yet he could not stop. The thought of her sustained him, even as it threatened to consume him. "Do you think she is alive?" Alexei asked Mikhail that night, a voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Mikhail looked into the flames. "I do not know," he said. "But if she is probably thinking of you in the same way you are thinking of her. Survival is a cruel mirror, Alexei. Sometimes the only connection you have to another person is a memory, and it can be as sharp as any blade." Alexei nodded, understanding fully. Memory could save, and memory could destroy. He felt both the terror and the exhilaration of carrying her within him, of letting her presence guide his steps even in her absence. And so, he continued. Each day,
Each night, each step through the merciless snow was fueled not only by the need to survive, but by the impossible hope that she had survived too. That somewhere in the frozen expanse, she waited, watching, perhaps longing, perhaps regretting. The connection they shared defied reason, defied the brutality of the world, yet it persisted, a fragile, dangerous thread between two souls caught in a machine of cruelty. The forest had become both sanctuary and trap. Each tree was a potential shield against the cold, each shadow a hiding place. Yet Alexei had learned that danger could be anywhere, behind a tree, in the snow, or in the faint crunch of footsteps. Hunger and fatigue gnawed at him relentlessly, but the thought of her eyes, her hands, the brief warmth of her whisper, drove him forward. It was a hunger far deeper than anything physical, a need that clawed at his chest. One evening, as the wind howled through the skeletal trees, Alexei stumbled upon a partially frozen river. The ice cracked underfoot, each sound magnified in the silent night. He crouched low, scanning the banks for signs of patrols, or worse, the trackers that Mikhail had warned him about. The river seemed endless, stretching like a white ribbon into the darkness. Crossing it was perilous, but he had no choice. Survival demanded risk. As he moved cautiously, he heard the faintest whisper of movement behind him. His heart slammed against his ribs. He spun, searching through the snow and shadows. Nothing. Yet he could not shake the sensation that he was being watched. He paused, listening to the wind, the faint murmur of the river, the distant call of a night bird. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from the shadows themselves, he heard it. "Do not fear me." Alexei froze. His mind recoiled in disbelief. The words were unmistakable. He turned in every direction but saw nothing. The voice had come from nowhere, and yet it was hers, soft, deliberate, commanding. For a moment, fear and hope tangled violently inside him. Was it her? Could she have followed him through the forest, risking everything again? Or was it the cold and his exhaustion conjuring illusions? He shook his head violently, trying to dispel the thought. "I cannot survive on illusions," he told himself. "I cannot follow shadows. I must survive." Yet the memory of her voice lingered, sharp and insistent, a guide and a torment. Night fell fully, and Alexei found a shallow cave for shelter. He lit a small fire, enough to keep the worst of the cold at bay. The flames flickered across his gaunt face, highlighting the hollowed eyes and raw determination that had taken hold of him. He thought of her constantly, the way her hand had brushed against his in the commander's office, the quiet nod that had given him hope, the way she had sacrificed her safety for him. As he stared into the fire, he spoke aloud, though he knew no one would answer. "Why did you save me? Why risk everything?" His voice was hoarse, but it carried his desperation into the empty night. The cave swallowed the words, leaving only echoes. He shivered, not entirely from cold, but from the impossible warmth that her memory stirred in his chest. The following days were a relentless trial. Snow blinded him, hunger made his legs tremble, and the wind cut like knives through his thin coat. Every movement was an exercise in endurance. And yet each night he returned to the memory of her, drawing strength from the impossible, forbidden connection. He imagined her in the camp, enduring, and perhaps punishing others, and perhaps regretting. The duality of her presence haunted him, blending fear and longing into a singular obsession. One morning, he came across a small village, abandoned in haste. Smoke rose from a broken chimney, suggesting someone had fled, leaving food and supplies behind. He scavenged carefully, finding bread and dried meat and a small flask of water. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope, nourishment, and warmth, and a fragile reprieve. Yet the shadows of the past were never far behind. The camp, the commander, the knowledge of her sacrifice, all followed him like ghosts in the snow. As he rested, he allowed himself a dangerous indulgence. He imagined her. He saw her in every detail, the curve of her lips, the cold authority in her gaze, the subtle softness that betrayed her humanity. His chest ached with a combination of longing and fear. How could one person embody both terror and salvation so completely? The thought was maddening, yet it sustained him. Night fell again, and Alexei found himself crouched in the remnants of an old barn. The wind rattled the boards, and the shadows danced in the flickering firelight. He felt a sudden presence, subtle but undeniable. Turning, he saw a figure at the edge of the barn, partially obscured by darkness. For a moment, his heart leapt. Could it be her? Could she have followed him, defying all logic and survival? "Who's there?" he demanded, a voice trembling. The figure stepped forward slightly, revealing a face he could not fully discern. The features were familiar, yet the distance and shadow obscured them. "Come closer," he whispered, almost unwilling to believe his own words. The figure paused, then spoke in that unmistakable voice. "Do not be afraid." Alexei's knees nearly gave out. It was her. Somehow, impossibly, she had survived. Somehow, she had come. The paradox of fear and longing, love and danger, converged into a single, overwhelming moment. You came," he stammered, tears freezing on his cheeks. I thought I had lost you." She stepped closer, the shadows retreating to reveal her face, pale but resolute. "I never abandoned you," she said quietly. "I could not. Not when there was a chance, however small." They sat in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling between them. The world outside the barn, a frozen, hostile expanse. Words were unnecessary. The act of being together, even briefly, was both salvation and peril. She spoke then, hesitantly, as if choosing each word with care. "I did what I had to do in the camp. I followed orders. I could not let you die without a chance." Alexei reached for her hand, feeling the warmth that contrasted so violently with the cruelty of the world around them. "Why?" he asked, a voice breaking. "Why me? Out of all the lives, why did you care?" She looked away, gaze fixed on the flickering fire. "Because I saw life in you," she whispered. "And life is dangerous, yes, but it is also precious." The paradox was unbearable. He wanted to hate her for the pain she had caused, for the world she represented, yet he could not. Every instinct, every shred of reason told him that she was both the tormentor and the salvation he had been searching for. As the night deepened, they planned their next move. The commander's reach was long, the patrols relentless, and every moment outside the safety of shadows was fraught with danger. Yet together, they were stronger, each step guided by shared knowledge, each breath a testament to the impossible trust they had forged. "We cannot linger here," she said finally. "They will come. The commander will not forgive." Alexei nodded, understanding fully. "Then we move," he said. "Together." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt a strange exhilaration. Danger had not disappeared. Fear still lurked in every shadow, and yet, in her presence, the fear was tempered by something else, something fragile, fierce, and defiant. Love, in the middle of death and cruelty, had found a way.
And so they left the barn, slipping into the night, two fragile figures against an endless expanse of snow. Each step was a defiance of the world that sought to destroy them, each movement a testament to the impossible bond that had formed between them. The forest closed around them, swallowing their footprints, hiding their passage. The wind carried the distant echoes of the camp, yet they moved forward, driven by a hope that was both terrifying and irresistible. Every rustle, every crack of ice underfoot reminded them that survival was a fleeting gift. Yet together, they felt a spark of something greater, something that made even the cold, the fear, and the relentless threat of death bearable. And as they vanished into the shadows, Alexei knew one thing with absolute clarity. He would never let her go. The world could be cruel, the system merciless, but he had found a spark of life in the darkness, and he would carry it through snow, through fear, through death itself, as long as he could breathe. The forest that had once seemed like refuge now felt like a cage. Every shadow could conceal a patrol. Every distant sound could signal death. Alexei and she moved cautiously, guided by the faint light of the moon glinting off the snow. Each step was calculated, deliberate, yet the relentless cold gnawed at them, and hunger made every movement a battle. Alexei's mind raced with questions he dared not voice. Why had she really saved him? Was it affection, guilt, or some twisted sense of duty? He looked at her often, studying the subtle lines of her face, the way her eyes, always alert, seemed to soften when they met his. Yet there was a tension in her posture, a quiet rigidity that reminded him she was still the agent of the machine he had fled. She noticed his gaze. "Do not stare," she said sharply, though her voice carried a faint tremor. "We must conserve our energy. The patrols will be out soon." He lowered his eyes, chastened. But the thought persisted, unrelenting. Her proximity was unbearable and necessary all at once. Every moment together was a paradox, relief and torment intertwined so tightly he felt he could barely breathe. Days passed, and the forest offered little reprieve. Tracks of soldiers in the snow reminded them that the commander's reach extended far. They hunted relentlessly, and Alexei understood that their survival depended on constant movement, vigilance, and occasional improvisation. One evening, as they huddled in a shallow hollow beneath a fallen tree, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "They are closing in. The commander, he will not forgive," she said, her eyes fixed on the snow, scanning for the slightest movement. Alexei nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "We'll survive," he said, though the tremor in his own voice betrayed his doubt. "We have to." For a moment, silence enveloped them. Then, in a voice softer than the wind through the trees, he asked, "Why did you save me? Truly, was it duty or something else?" She looked at him then, her eyes glinting with a mixture of fear and defiance. "It was not duty alone," she said. "I saw something in you,
a spark, something that should not have existed in that place, in that world. I could not extinguish it, even if it meant risking my own life. Alexei's chest tightened. He wanted to speak, to tell her what he felt, yet words failed him. The truth was dangerous. Love in a place like this was an enemy as deadly as the commander or the snow. And yet, the thought of her, alive and with him, sustained him. Their journey took them closer to the mountains, a terrain both perilous and protective. The slopes were steep, the wind merciless, and the snow unyielding. Alexei had never known exhaustion like this, nor fear so constant. Yet in the moments when they rested, when she allowed herself to sit close to him, he felt a fragile connection that made the agony bearable. One night, as they sheltered in the hollow of a rock, he whispered, "Do you regret saving me?" She hesitated. Her fingers brushed against his, fleeting, and the touch sent a shiver through him. "I regret nothing," she said finally, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "But I fear everything. Fear for you, fear for myself, fear of what the commander will do if he catches us."
Alexei wanted to take her hand in his, to hold it, to anchor both of them to a fleeting sense of safety. But he hesitated. Even here, even in the silence of the mountains, danger was absolute. Trust was precious and fragile. The days became a blur of snow, cold, and careful movement. They found abandoned cabins, scavenged food, and avoided villages where patrols might still be present. At night, they whispered to each other, sharing fragments of life before the camp, memories that seemed impossibly distant, yet dangerously alive. "You were once a writer, was not you?" she asked one night, as they huddled against the cold. Alexei nodded, surprised she remembered. "Yes," he said. "Stories. They were the only escape I ever had." She looked at him then, and for a moment, the harsh mask of the camp melted. "Perhaps you can write again," she said softly. "Even here. Even now." He smiled faintly, a bitter twist of lips. "Perhaps. But the words, they taste like blood and snow now." A sudden noise interrupted their fragile conversation, a snapping of branches, the crunch of snow. They froze. Instinctively, she pulled Alexei behind a boulder. Shadows shifted in the distance. A patrol. Soldiers moved with practiced precision, searching for fugitives. Alexei's heart pounded. He wanted to fight, to run, yet her hand on his arm was firm, restraining. "Wait," she whispered. "We cannot outrun them. Not yet." We move when they do not expect it. They crouched in silence, breath visible in the icy air. The patrol moved past, dangerously close, and for a moment, Alexei thought he might collapse from the tension. But she remained calm, her presence a tether against the rising panic. When the soldiers passed, she exhaled softly. "You see why I saved you?" she said quietly. "Even now, life is worth clinging to." He could only nod. Words were inadequate. Every fiber of his being was attuned to her, to the precariousness of their existence, and to the fragile, impossible connection they had forged in the darkness. As they pressed deeper into the mountains, their conversation shifted, growing intimate yet dangerous. They spoke of small things, memories of childhood, fleeting dreams of freedom. Each word was a rebellion against the cruelty of the world that had shaped them. One evening, Alexei asked, "If we survive, if we truly escape, what then?"
She looked at him, her eyes dark pools reflecting the firelight. "Then we live," she said simply. "We live, no matter what it takes. Even if the world wants to destroy us, even if the snow and the cold try to swallow us whole, we live." Alexei's chest tightened. The simplicity of her words contrasted violently with the complexity of their reality. Living was no longer a given. It was a defiance, a choice made in spite of cruelty. Yet as dawn approached, the mountains revealed their own dangers. A sudden blizzard descended, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The wind tore at their faces, biting through layers of clothing, forcing them to huddle together for warmth. They stumbled through the snow, each step a struggle, guided only by memory and instinct. At one point, Alexei fell, hidden under a drift of fresh snow. She pulled him up, her hands gripping his coat with fierce determination. "Do not give in," she hissed. "Not now, not ever." Her words, like the memory of her touch, drove him forward. Each step was agony, each breath a battle. And yet, even in the storm, even in the blinding white, their connection endured, a fragile thread of humanity, of desire, of impossible love. By nightfall, they found shelter in a small cave. Exhausted, they collapsed beside each other, bodies pressed together for warmth, hearts pounding in unison. In the flickering firelight, she whispered, "I should not have loved you." Alexei took her hand, pressing it to his chest. "I do not care. Love is the only thing that keeps me alive." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "It is dangerous. It could kill us both." He shook his head. "Then let it. I would rather die with you than live without you." They held each other through the night, the storm raging outside, the world reduced to nothing but the two of them and the fragile hope that had sustained them so far. In the darkness, Alexei realized that love, even in the harshest cruelty, was a weapon as powerful as any rifle, any escape, any act of survival. It could protect, it could destroy, and it could endure beyond reason. And yet, in the quiet moments, beneath the layers of snow and fear, a single truth remained. Survival was not enough. To live without her would be a fate worse than death. And so, they pressed onward, hearts bound, spirits defiant, against a world that sought to crush them, and against a system that would not forgive the audacity of their connection. The blizzard had passed, leaving the mountains glazed with ice, each ridge and crevice treacherous and unyielding. Alexei and she moved cautiously, their breath misting in the frigid air, bodies shivering despite layers of clothing. The memory of the camp, the commander, the patrols, all haunted every step. Survival demanded absolute attention. Yet the bond between them had become a chain of a different kind, one that neither could loosen. They had been walking for days, pushing further from the reach of the camp, each footstep through the snow a declaration of defiance. And yet, fear remained a constant companion. Alexei often glanced at her, noting the tension in her jaw, the way her hands flexed at her sides. She had saved him once, twice, perhaps more times than he could count, and he knew she would do it again if necessary. But the world they inhabited did not forgive vulnerability, and love in such a place was both a weapon and a trap. "Alexei," she whispered, stopping abruptly. "Do you hear that?" He listened, straining against the whisper of the wind. At first, there was nothing but the sound of snow shifting under their feet and the occasional groan of the ice. Then, faintly, a crunch too measured, too deliberate. Patrols. Close. He grabbed her arm, pressing her behind a ridge. "We cannot outrun them in the open," he said, voice tight. "We must use the terrain." She nodded, eyes scanning the horizon. "We move silently. Stay low," she murmured. Her hands brushed his, fleeting and electric, a reminder of the warmth that had kept him alive in the cold. Hours passed in near silence, each shadow, each snowdrift a potential threat. Hunger clawed at them, yet they pressed forward, driven by the same instinct that had carried them through the forest, the need to survive, and the need to protect one another. Night fell, darker than any before. They found a shallow cave at the edge of a cliff, its entrance masked by icicles and snow. Alexei lit a small fire inside, the flickering light casting long shadows that danced across their faces. They ate in silence, sharing what little food they had scavenged. "I thought I might never see you again," Alexei said finally, breaking the quiet. His voice was low, almost a confession. "I feared the snow, the patrols, that I would wake and find you gone." She looked at him, eyes glistening. "I feared the same," she admitted. "But leaving you alive was the only way to survive myself. If I had stayed, I might have died. Or worse, we both might have." He reached for her hand, holding it gently. "I owe you my life," he whispered. "More than that, Her finger pressed to his lips. "Do not speak it yet. We must survive first." The following days were a trial of endurance. They navigated treacherous slopes, avoided patrols that had somehow tracked them this far, and scavenged what they could. Each night, the cold pressed against them like a living thing, but each night, they found a fragile warmth in one another's presence. Then, one evening, as they crested a ridge, Alexei froze. Below them, in a valley glimmering under the pale light of the moon, a small encampment came into view. Tents, torches, and shadows moving among them. His stomach sank. The camp. Somehow, they had been followed. "They know we're here," he whispered. Fear edged his words. "We must not be seen." She studied the camp, calculating. "There is a path through the trees," she said, pointing toward a narrow ravine that might provide cover. "But it will be risky. The snow is thin, the ice unstable." Alexei swallowed hard. "We have no choice," he said. "We take it." They moved carefully, each step measured, hearts pounding. The shadows below shifted. Patrols were moving, searching. Alexei felt his pulse hammering, each beat a drum of life and imminent death. She was beside him, silent, her presence a constant tether. He could not imagine moving without her, and yet the very act of holding her close carried unimaginable risk. Suddenly, a voice called out from the valley, clear, sharp, inhumanly calm. "There you are." Alexei's blood ran cold. The commander. She pressed against him, whispering urgently, "Run. Leave me. This is my trap, not yours." "No," Alexei said, voice raw. "I will not leave you." Her eyes met his, dark and haunted. "You must. Trust me. If we stay together, we die." The commander's men began to advance, their torches cutting paths through the snow, illuminating the world in an unforgiving glare. Panic surged. Alexei wanted to fight, but the odds were impossible. She grabbed his hand and dragged him into the ravine. The descent was treacherous. Ice crumbled beneath their feet, snow avalanches threatening to swallow them whole.
They slid, stumbled, and fell, but pressed forward, the roar of pursuit close behind. Finally, they reached a narrow ledge above a chasm. The cliff dropped into darkness, the wind howling below. She stopped, gripping his shoulders, her breath ragged. "Alexei, I cannot go further," she said. "I will hold them off. You must survive. Run. Promise me." He shook his head violently. "No, I cannot leave you. We survive together." She pressed her forehead to his. "You must. This is the only way." The first soldiers reached the ledge. She turned to face them, raising her arms, a figure of defiance and sacrifice. Alexei stared, frozen, as she became a target. "Go!" she shouted, shoving him toward the edge. He hesitated, then leaped, sliding down the slope into deeper snow. He looked back once, barely catching sight of her as she confronted the soldiers alone. Hours later, exhausted and frozen, he stumbled into a village miles away, barely conscious. He collapsed in an abandoned barn, and for the first time since the camp, allowed himself to weep. He had survived, but at what cost? Days turned into weeks. Alexei recovered physically, yet his mind remained tethered to the mountains, to the sacrifice she had made. He could not forget her, could not forgive the world that demanded such cruel choices. Then, one morning, a stranger arrived in the village. Covered in snow and ice, face almost unrecognizable, yet there was something in the posture, the eyes, something hauntingly familiar. Alexei froze. Could it be? The figure stepped forward. The hood fell back. The face was hers. But something was wrong. Her eyes, once dark and human, were cold, unreadable, almost inhuman. A faint scar traced across her cheek, a mark of the commander's final cruelty. She smiled, but it was not the smile he remembered. "Welcome back, Alexei," she said softly. "I told you, love cannot save you." Alexei staggered backward. You survived?" "Yes," she said, voice calm. "But I am not the woman you knew. The camp, it changes everyone. And now, we are both changed. You survived, yes, but survival alone is no salvation." He stared, unable to comprehend the paradox. The woman he loved, the woman who had saved him, who had sacrificed herself, stood before him alive, yet not alive as he had imagined. Something fundamental had shifted. The horror of the camp had left its mark, unthinkable, irreversible. Her hand reached for him. "Do you still want to survive?" she asked. "Do you still want to live?" Alexei realized, with a shock that froze his heart, that the choice before him was no longer survival or death. It was something darker. To embrace her, and the twisted reality of what the camp had made her, or to turn away, abandoning the impossible connection that had carried him this far. He stepped forward slowly, trembling, and in that moment, the wind carried a sound he would never forget. The faint echo of the commander's laugh, distant, omnipresent, a reminder that some horrors never truly end.